The views, information, and opinions expressed during the following program are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent the views of Access Communications, its representatives, or its employees.
The RCMP Heritage Centre is a not-for-profit charitable organisation mandated to share the story of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. This is one of those stories, part of your heritage.
Well, you know that I came from a big family. We were 7 children. My father was a radio announcer, and my mother was a housekeeper. But I came from a very, very loving family. And during my time in school, I did well, but sports and girls took a priority in my life at that time. But when I was in grade 8, which would have been around 1957, I took a real interest in Army cadets. And that was the beginning of my interest in things military. And I really took a real interest in the Army cadets during grade 8 and grade 9 and excelled and became noticeable to my teachers and principal. And then in grade 9, I joined the Canadian Militia. And those two activities, the Army cadets during the day and the militia at night, just after World War II, was preparing Canada for the so-called Cold War. And cadets and militia were a big activity, not only to myself, but to a lot of young men in St. Stephen, New Brunswick. And so as I progressed through high school, my mind turned more to the possibility of a life in the military. But one day in grade 11, my pal and I decided to skip school because we had gone through school together from grade 1, and we had been good boys, and we thought we should do something out of the ordinary. So Fred and I decided to skip classes this particular May afternoon. And it was our strategy for him to hitchhike first on the Trans-Canada to a well-known swimming hole. And then I would wait a few minutes after he left. And then I would start to hitchhike. Well, out of the blue came a police car driven by an RCMP constable in boots and breeches. And he was driving an old Studebaker with the red cherry bubble on top of the police car, 2-door. And so he stopped where I was on the Trans-Canada outside St. Stephen, New Brunswick. And I thought for sure that there had been a conspiracy between the teachers, but I thought, how would they know that I had skipped, and how would they have known where I was? So he stopped and he said, hop in, and I did. And he took me 7 miles to the swimming hole where Fred was, and dropped me off. And on the way to the swimming hole, he talked to me about high school and life thereafter. And he said, you know, have you ever thought about the Mounties, the RCMP? And I hadn't. My mind was totally occupied with cadets and militia, and in all likelihood, my future in the Canadian Infantry. So he and I became good friends. He also had an interest in cadets when he was in school. His name was Bill McClellan, and he had gone through training about 1959. So he wasn't that much older than me, but he had already been in the force 5 years. And he had been to other places in New Brunswick before he landed in St. Stephen, New Brunswick. So he said, after he deposited me in, at the swimming hole, he said to me, keep in touch. And I did. by coincidence, he and his wife moved much closer to our home, the Healy home. And my sisters became babysitters for Bill and his wife. And because of that relationship, Bill and I saw more and more of each other. And so a year passed. I went into grade 12. And in the meantime, he had invited me out on patrols at night. And on one particular weekend, he took me over to Campobello Island, which is part of the J Division jurisdiction. But to get to Campobello, you have to drive through the state of Maine, which was kind of unique because here we were in a marked car going through American customs and immigration on the American side. He was armed, and we drove through the state of Maine down the east coast for an hour and a half before we took the international bridge from Maine back over to Campobello, which is owned by Canada. And so we spent the weekend there. And Campobello Island is a very, very, very small jurisdiction in J Division, only accessible through the state of Maine. And we were only on the island a moment or two when he stopped a car driven by a young teenager who didn't have a driver's license. And to me, it was a major case. But to him, it was a lesson for the young boy driving without a driver's license. And rather than give the young guy a ticket, I remember it so well. There he was standing on the highway on Campobello Island with this young boy. And rather than chastise him, or make him feel bad, you know, he simply insisted that his father or mother would have to come and get him and drive the car. And the whole event was over in a matter of moments. But it taught me a lesson about how I wanted to be. If I were to be successful and to join the force, I wanted to be like Bill McClellan. Work in uniform, deal with young people, deal with community people, deal with their lives and their problems, and if at all possible, handle these cases peacefully and not hinder the future life of the young person. So Bill gave the young person a warning, and the incident was over. That was the biggest crime that we saw on Campobello Island that weekend. So later in grade 12, he said to me, why don't you come down Saturday morning, write the exam. I'm working that day, but I've got to tell you up front, you're on your own when it comes to the exam. So I did. I went down in February of 1964 to the detachment Saturday morning and wrote the exam. And I was successful with the exam because the next stage was the interview with the inspector from Fredericton. And the interview with Inspector Farr occurred about May of 1964. And it was the most arduous part of the entire process. It was a complete afternoon, starting at 1 o'clock until about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And of course, I had to take the afternoon off from school with permission from my teachers. And Inspector Farr interviewed me at the detachment that afternoon. And a lot of the conversation that he had with me had to do with cadets, my relationship with the militia, my aspirations for a life in military or semi-military kind of a life. And I got the impression and the perception as the interview went on that I likely would do well. And in June, I graduated from grade 12, June of 1964, and I had only graduated a few days. I sent my marks to Fredericton, and in early July, I had my acceptance to join the force. and the date was August the 20th, 1964, for me to report to Fredericton, and that's what I did. Very, very vivid experience for me. My dad drove me to Fredericton on August the 19th. He and I went to the swearing-in ceremony with 3 other young men in Fredericton, August the 20th. And then that night, we took the train from Fredericton out to Regina. And I remember as we hopscotched across the country, that we picked up other young men with short haircuts. And they were very, very recognizable, and they joined the small group of us that began in New Brunswick, and then through Montreal, we picked up a couple more, and then through Ontario. And it was 3 days on the train. We arrived in Regina on a beautiful, beautiful Sunday morning at 6 a.m. in downtown Regina, and we were met by 2 huge RCMP recruits in boots and breeches with Stetsons. And they looked to me like they were as tall as the Empire State Building. And they were very gruff and very, very assertive, very confident. And we were instructed to pick up our kit and toss it in the back of the 2 cars that had come down to pick us up. And I recall that I had left home with a new suit that my mom and dad had bought for me for graduation from high school, and I had a small trunk. And I may have had $60. I might have had $60 in my pocket to start training. And I had learned a lot about the depot experience from Bill McClellan and other members at the detachment. I certainly knew that the physical component was the major part of the recruit experience. I had never ridden a horse. I was a fair swimmer, and I was in pretty good condition. At least I thought I was. And you can imagine, I had just turned 19. I was 141 pounds. I was 6 feet tall, so very, very slender. And that profile matched the profile of the majority of us in our troop. So training in those days began with a week of coming together. Not all of our troop were there the first day as we were from the East Coast. And we settled into our dormitory and were assigned a bed. And as the week progressed, more and more members came from various parts of Canada to join what we became known as G Troop, 1964, 1965. And the week was a week of busy, unorganized activities. In other words, we had not been squatted. So members of our troop were assigned to fatigue duties, cleaning brass, sweeping parade squares, mowing grass, those kinds of things, painting. Whatever work had to be done was done by our troop that week, in addition to drawing our kit and becoming familiar with our way around depot. I recall so fondly that on one particular morning, Corporal Jessman came to our dormitory, and Corporal Jessman, Corporal D. Jessman, was a riding instructor. And he also was very, very gruff and loud and forceful. And Corporal Jessman said in unprintable language that he needed a group of rabble or recruits to dig a grave. So he led us he led about 9 or 10 of us from our dormitory over to the tool shed. And he pointed to pickaxe and shovels and spades, and told each of us to grab some tools and then to follow him. And he took us over to the cemetery and pointed to a spot and simply said to us, dig. And his instructions were, dig it deep and dig it straight. And so we started to dig this hole, this grave, for someone. And it took us 2 days. It was late August. By this time, it probably was the 24th and 25th of August, 1964. And our job over those 2 days were to successfully dig a grave. And we didn't know who had died. Well, by the following Sunday and Monday, our troop was squatted. We had 32 members, and we started the formal process of training. And it was that week that we were witness to a huge Red Surge parade, a funeral, which took place from the chapel over to the cemetery. And it was at that time that we learned that Sergeant Coghlan had passed away, and it was his grave that we had dug. Now, Sergeant Coghlan has a very unique place in our CMP history because he was the man that designed the roof and the cross for the chapel. He also designed the gates on Duty Avenue for a depot division. But he was also on the bodyguard for the visit of Queen Elizabeth when she came to Canada. Sergeant Coghlan had spent a lot of his time in the gymnasium, and he was a PT instructor and a boxer. And he had become a welterweight boxing Canadian champion. And so I suspect that he was chosen for his role in bodyguards because of his physical attributes. So there he was buried, and as the years went by and I had other opportunities to go back to Regina to visit, I went over to the cemetery time and time again to roam around and visit some of the great names in the force that are buried there. And I always stopped and paused at Sergeant Coghlan's grave and recalled that that was the grave that my troop and I had dug under the watchful eyes of Corporal Justman. In those days, the depot experience was usually a physical exercise. We had 2 rides a week. We had a PT practically every day, swimming almost every day, foot drill almost every day. So that only left time for 2 or 3 periods a day for academics. And I think it's fair to say that my troop really became engaged more on the physical side of the experience than the academic side. I don't think any of us were Nobel kind of learners. We were there because we had certain inspirations and certain thoughts about the kind of a police officer that we wanted to be, modeled after the men that we had met in the field, and we wanted to do that kind of work. So scenes of crimes was interesting to us. Traffic investigations was of interest to us. But the criminal code and federal statutes were kind of dry and dull, and didn't take as much of an interest to us as the outdoor activities. I was particularly lucky that I wasn't shocked when I got to depot. I wasn't shocked by the attitudes or the yelling or the shouting of the instructors. I had heard the language before, I had heard the vocabulary before, I knew its purpose. I wasn't as stressed as some of my friends were about what they heard from the instructors, either on the parade square or in the drill hall or in the gymnasium. So I became the very first day I was voted the right marker of our troop, and we had a good troop. We had young men from every province, excepting the territories, and we jammed together quickly, and we jammed together very, very tight. And my job was made more light because all that was expected of me was to form the troop up and get the troop from point A to point B. It wasn't necessary for me to enforce any sanctions on the troop, because we were on time for our classes, and we were enthusiastic and lots of energy, because we were all 19 years of age. And we came together well. You'll recall that in those days we had no time off. The only time that we got a bit of a break was on Saturday afternoons. And the reason for that, of course, was because we had about 120 horses, and they had to be fed 3 and 4 times a day, and groomed and exercised every day. And so there were troops, or there were a troop or troops responsible for the horses every day, and that only allowed some troops some time off on Saturday afternoon to go downtown. So it was a true 24-hour-a-day depot experience. I recall that I couldn't afford to call home in those days. The notion of long-distance calls was not as familiar to us at that time. I wrote home once a week. My mother and father still had 6 children at home, and I remember that I sent most of my salary home to my parents because we didn't need a lot of money at depot. We didn't. Everything was provided. Our uniforms were provided. Our food was provided. Our shelter was provided, and we didn't have any time to go downtown to spend money. So I remember that my paycheck at that time came to $99 every 2 weeks, and of that $99, $80 every 2 weeks, I got a money order and sent money home to my parents. And I did that for the 9 months that I was at depot, and continued it, of course, after I graduated and went to the West Coast. So to sum up the depot experience, it is still very, very memorable for me. I was particularly lucky that I didn't get injured during the depot experience. I was thrown off the horses on 2 occasions, but I landed either on my feet or on my rump and wasn't hurt. I didn't have any injuries in the gymnasium during the rigors of the running and the gymnastics. So, and because of my role as the right marker, it remains today as a very, very memorable experience. And I can recall the instructors today as favorably as I did back in those days. Many of them now have passed on, of course, but they were a great bunch of men whom I recall had very meaningful field experiences. And I recall, for example, during criminal code and during federal statutes, that the instructors for those topics were men who had done investigations in the field. And a lot of the learning that they passed on, a lot of the teaching that they passed on was done through story form. So the instructor would take a piece of legislation from the code and then relate it to us by way of what he had done under similar circumstances. And I listened intently, but I can tell you that there were times when I obviously didn't listen well enough, because my first transfer took me to Burnaby, British Columbia. And apart from other assignments, I went out to my first break and enter by myself. And by coincidence, the woman, the homeowner, had collected a huge collection of crystal. And I was fascinated by the crystal because it was very similar to a collection that my mother had had. And so in my interest in investigating this serious break and enter, I picked up a piece of crystal with my bare hands, and I got the woman talking to me about this piece of crystal, and then placed it down again, never thinking for a moment that I had left my my fingerprint behind. And so the IDENT members came in several hours later to print the scene, and weeks and weeks and weeks went by when I was called into the IDENT sergeant's office and said, you remember that break and enter that you had gone to over on in Burnaby South, and you recall that you might have picked up a piece of an exhibit? And I said, yes, I think I did, actually. Well, he said, you did, because he said the only print that we got was your print. And it caused me some teasing and some embarrassment to think that perhaps I should have been paying more attention in depot to scenes of crimes, and it taught me a valuable lesson about not touching exhibits when you go to scenes of crimes.